The Alaskan coast was a cemetery of piercing winds and violent waves, and amid that vast expanse of dark water and jagged rocks, the Glasshaven lighthouse stood against time like a forgotten sentinel. Jonas Mercer, the new keeper, stepped off the boat with heavy strides, feeling the weight of the icy dampness clinging to his skin. There was no welcome, only the squeaking of the structure's rusty metal and the sea, ever restless, whispering a secret that no one seemed willing to hear. The boat that had dropped him off departed without delay, as if that place were cursed. Mercer watched the boat's lights disappear, swallowed by the dense fog covering the horizon. He knew what people said about the lighthouse. Previous keepers had gone mad, disappeared, died without explanation. But he was not a superstitious man. He had spent his life studying the ocean, investigating its anomalies, witnessing events that would make any sailor give up the trade. Still, what awaited him in Glasshaven was different. Deep down, he felt that this lighthouse had not been built to guide ships, but to observe something far older than humanity. The first days were silent, but not peaceful. The lighthouse structure was solid, resistant to time and salt, yet something inside it felt wrong. Mercer could smell the brine ingrained in the corridors, on the damp walls, on the thick glass of the tower that reflected light like an old mirror. While exploring the quarters, he found belongings of the previous keeper, moldy clothes, a broken radio, notebooks scattered over a table. He leafed through one of them, frenzied notes, disjointed passages, words crossed out with force. The lighthouse does not illuminate, it sees. Mercer closed the notebook with an involuntary shiver. That was just paranoia, the delusions of a man isolated for too long. But then, on the following night, he saw it for the first time. The lighthouse's glass began to glow abnormally, reflecting a light that did not come from the lamps he had just inspected. Mercer drew closer, feeling the air inside the tower become dense, electrified, as though something were moving in the atmosphere. The glass was capturing something beyond the visible world. He had no explanation for it, but what he saw next erased any trace of skepticism he still harbored. The ocean below, beneath the darkness of a moonless night, reflected an impossible shape. An eye, vast and deep as an abyss, rippled among the waves. Mercer blinked, his heart pounding in his chest. It was not a reflection. It couldn't be. He felt its pulse within himself, as if he were being studied, catalogued by something that existed beyond human logic. The lighthouse trembled slightly, or perhaps he was the one trembling. He wiped his eyes, stepped away from the glass, trying to force a rational explanation. But when he looked again, the eye was still there, fixed on him, motionless, while the waves around it surged as though they were a veil covering its hidden body in the depths. He tried to record it with his camera, but the screen only showed static. The radio crackled nonstop. The lighthouse glass seemed to vibrate beneath his fingers. And then, the eye blinked. Mercer instinctively recoiled. Something inside his mind whispered that he should not be there, that this was not a discovery, but a warning. He left the tower, shut the door, and descended the metal steps to the lower quarters, where he locked himself in the small dormitory. His breathing was rapid. He refused to accept what he had seen, but he knew that from that moment on, the sea was watching him back. The next morning, everything seemed the same. The lighthouse still stood, fog drifted slowly along the coast, and the ocean echoed its eternal song. But Mercer felt that something had changed. The radio remained distorted, spewing incomprehensible noises, but now, between the crackles, he picked up fragments of voices, distant, like someone whispering from the bottom of the ocean. The previous keeper's journal was still on the table. He read more. There are patterns. There are sounds. The glass hears them. Mercer flipped through the pages until he found something that made him shudder, a rough sketch, drawn with jittery strokes. It was the same eye he had seen the previous night. He knew it was not a coincidence. The previous keeper had seen it too, and if he was right, then Mercer was not the first to be observed. He picked up the radio and tried tuning it to a clear frequency, but the only thing he could pick up was a single word, repeated among the static, in a voice that was not human. Jonas. His own name. The day blurred with restlessness. He tried to keep a routine, checking the generator, inspecting the electrical system, but his mind kept returning to the night before. Each time he looked at the sea, he felt as though something were waiting for him to look back. The lighthouse glass remained strange, reflecting colors that did not belong to the sky or the water. Mercer revisited old records and found something even more disturbing. Previous keepers had never stayed at the lighthouse for more than a year. Some left the post without explanation. Others disappeared. He found old news stories, cases of ghost ships and fishermen who claimed to see lights moving underwater, so large they looked like entire cities pulsating at the ocean floor. He needed to find out more, yet part of him knew the truth could be worse than any legend. That night, the fog thickened abnormally, turning the lighthouse into an isolated island from the rest of the world. Mercer lit his lantern and climbed the tower, his hand hesitating on the doorknob. The lighthouse glass glowed with distorted patterns, rippling like liquid mirror. He opened the door, a shudder running through him. The eye was there again, but this time, it wasn't reflected in the waters below. It was inside the glass. Mercer stood paralyzed, unable to react, as the thing's pupil contracted, as though adjusting its focus. Something inside him broke. The lighthouse did not illuminate the sea. It was a window. And now, something on the other side was looking too. Have you ever looked at the ocean and felt as though something down there was looking back at you? What Mercer found cannot be explained, but perhaps it can be felt. Leave in the comments your theory about what's happening, and share this mystery with those who also need to know the truth. The lighthouse glass seemed to vibrate from the inside out, and Jonas Mercer felt something warp inside his mind. The eye remained there, not just looking, but studying, measuring, testing the limits of his sanity. His body was rigid, frozen between the urge to flee and the need to understand. The waves below crashed against the rocks, but they weren't the only things moving. There were shadows beneath the surface, shapes that seemed to writhe, as though something were trying to cross the barrier between worlds. He blinked, and for a second the reflection in the glass changed. It wasn't the sea he saw. It was something bigger, a colossal structure, made of impossible matter, slowly rotating at the ocean's bottom. He shouldn't have been able to see that, but he did. A resonant sound coursed through his head, something that did not pass through his ears but straight into his brain. The lighthouse's frequency wavered, as if translating a code he had never learned. Then, amid the radio's static, a distorted voice whispered a single word: descend. Jonas pulled back, heart hammering in his chest. The lighthouse glass pulsed as if it had a life of its own, projecting colors that did not belong to the night. He forced his body to move and went down the metal steps, feeling his breathing quick and erratic. The lighthouse was no longer a refuge. With each step, something inside him told him he shouldn't be there. The wind howled, shoving fog against the structure, making everything around him indistinct, unreal. Reaching the main hall, the radio kept crackling, shifting between static and muffled sounds. He approached and turned the dial, trying to find a clean frequency. But what came through made his stomach turn. It was a wail, not human. Something wet, dense, reverberating like an echo without origin. Jonas closed his eyes and tried to ignore the chill creeping up his spine. The sound changed again, this time becoming a deep rhythmic breathing. And then, a clear, undistorted word spoke from the other side of the frequency. Look at the water. He knew he shouldn't obey, yet something greater than himself drove him outside. The lighthouse now looked smaller than before, an insignificant point surrounded by the ocean's immensity, where the waves danced as though something enormous moved just below the surface. The wind carried a salty metallic scent, like wet iron. Jonas walked to the edge of the cliff, gripping the lantern tightly. The water below did not reflect the light. It was dark, opaque, as though of infinite depth. Then, a subtle change. Small ripples started to form, but they did not stem from the natural tide's movement. Something was rising, slowly. First came the shadow, an outline that shouldn't exist, something that bent the very ocean around it. Then, the water's surface broke, and darkness took shape. The eye. But this time it wasn't looking at the lighthouse. It was looking at him. Jonas felt his body freeze, his fingers numb from the cold dampness. The thing below emerged piece by piece, revealing more than just an eye. Around it was a structure, something like an organic pulsing wall, as though it were a fragment of a much larger body. The creature wasn't just a being, it was a living monument. Waves began forming around it, spinning in perfect circles. Jonas felt something within him respond, as if his body tried to align with that movement's frequency. The radio behind him crackled louder, and amid the distortion, he heard his own name being called. But the voice was neither human nor entirely alien. It was something in between, as if someone he knew was being translated by a greater entity. He took a step back, feeling the solid ground beneath his feet and the terrible sensation that, if he looked for too long, he would never be the same again. He spun abruptly and ran back to the lighthouse, slamming the door behind him. The radio now throbbed with a nearly musical frequency, in sync with the wave's noise. Jonas grabbed the previous keeper's journal and leafed through the pages, desperate for an explanation. The words were erratic, as though the man's mind had gradually crumbled. He saw, he listened, he understood, but too late. The notes spoke of cycles, of how the lighthouse was not a guide, but a marker. The light is not for humans, it's for them. Jonas felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. The lighthouse did not aid sailors, it marked them. Jonas's breathing grew heavier. He knew he should leave, but part of him also knew it was too late. He had already been seen. Night stretched beyond time. The radio, the glass, the water, everything vibrated as if trying to communicate something he was not ready to understand. The wind blew fiercely, yet it could not disperse the fog clinging to the island like a spectral veil. Then the lighthouse blinked, just once. But Jonas realized something terrible. He had not flipped the switch. The glass kept glowing, pulsating at a frequency that seemed to respond. Something below was waking up, something ancient, and now he didn't know if there was any way to stop it. The lighthouse pulsed like a living organism, its glass projecting geometric patterns that swirled in slow, hypnotic spirals, reflecting in the waves below. Jonas Mercer clung to the small office table, trying to avoid the inevitable. His body knew before his mind could accept it. He was no longer in the same world. The ocean, the wind, the lighthouse, everything seemed out of place, as though an invisible layer had been ripped away from reality, revealing something that had always been there, just waiting for someone to look too long. The pages of the previous keeper's diary trembled in his hand. He saw patterns in the writing, symbols that had not been there before, words he did not know how to read but somehow understood. It was as if the lighthouse were trying to communicate, as if the thing on the ocean floor were attempting to tell its story. The question he had been avoiding now loomed inevitably. The lighthouse was built to shine a light on the path, but for whom? He needed to get out. The thought came as a survival instinct, a spark of rationality fighting against the ocean of impossibilities surrounding him. But when he tried to stand, his body did not obey. It was as though the very air in the lighthouse had grown heavy, dense, holding him without the need for chains. Jonas saw his own reflection in the glass beside the table and felt something inside him shatter. The reflection did not mirror his movements perfectly. He blinked, and his image in the glass took a fraction of a second longer to do the same. It was subtle, but it was real. Fear coursed down his spine, a deep chill not from the sea's cold wind, but from something far older and far deeper. The radio crackled, the glass flickered, and then he smelled something that should not have been there. Salt water. The lighthouse was dry, yet the smell was strong, as if the waves were in the very air. Jonas slowly turned his head and saw a droplet trickle down the tower's glass. Then another. The lighthouse was crying. The glass quivered, and inside it, something moved. Jonas forced himself upright, his muscles stiff, each step harder than the last. He climbed the iron steps to the top, each footfall echoing through the metal cylinder. The lighthouse glowed, but now he realized that it was not ordinary light. It was no mere refraction. It was a code, a living language that danced and pulsed as though it were waiting to be read. He reached the top and froze. On the other side of the glass, the thing was waiting, but not how he had imagined. The eye was not in the ocean. It was in the sky. The clouds had cleared, and there, floating above the sea's dark expanse, was the same shape, the same dilated pupil, the same pulsating darkness that had once risen from the waves. The world spun around Jonas. The creature was not climbing from the depths. It was descending. The lighthouse flashed once, and the thing answered. A vibration shook the floor, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo within Jonas's skull. The lighthouse was not trying to warn anyone. It was calling. He staggered backward, mind grasping at any fragment of sanity it could still hold. But then, through the radio, a new voice emerged. A voice he recognized. Jonas. The name was spoken with his dead wife's voice. The ocean roared below, the waves rising and falling in a pattern no longer natural, but one that somehow followed the lighthouse's pulse. Jonas felt desperation wash over him. The lighthouse was bringing back something that should never return. He turned and ran down the steps, the echoes of his footsteps sounding like screams in his mind. He had to stop it. He had to shut off the light before it was too late. But the real question was, what if it was already too late? Jonas descended the lighthouse steps as though fleeing an invisible force, but he knew there was nowhere to run. The ground shook under his feet, the stairs' metal reverberating as if the structure were alive, responding to a power he did not understand. The lighthouse flashed, and with each pulse, he sensed a presence growing around him. The ocean roared outside, but it no longer sounded the same. There was a pattern, a cadence that did not belong to the natural movement of the water. He no longer needed to look to know. The thing was descending, and the lighthouse was opening the way for it. His name was called once more through the radio, in the voice of the woman he'd lost years ago, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something stronger than fear, anger. He didn't know if that voice was real, if the lighthouse was distorting his mind, or if something beyond his comprehension was toying with him. But one thing was certain: if the lighthouse was a gateway, he needed to close it. He crossed the main hall, shadows flickering around him as the panes of glass vibrated and squeaked, forming patterns that seemed to want to imprint themselves in his mind. Old papers and records flew through the air like dead leaves, and the radio, now out of control, emitted an impossible sound, a mixture of human voices and something that should not exist, as though different realities were overlapping. Jonas threw himself at the electrical panel, searching for the lighthouse's main switch. His fingers shook as he tried to shut down the structure, but the moment he touched the wires, a violent shock coursed through his body, as if he had touched something alive. The lighthouse did not want to be turned off. It was no longer just a building. It was part of something bigger, something that used the light to guide something into this world. And then he understood. The lighthouse did not shine for men. It shone for them. Outside, the waves began to change. The rhythm that once pulsed in sync with the lighthouse now became frantic, chaotic. Jonas ran to the door and flung it open, the cold night air engulfing him. The sea was splitting. On the horizon, a colossal rift opened in the waters, revealing something that shouldn't be there, something beyond human comprehension. Cyclopean structures emerged, rising like pillars of a sunken city, covered in bioluminescence and shapes that defied any logic. They pulsed, bent, and expanded like living organisms. The lighthouse flashed again. This time, the sky answered. Above, the clouds began to warp, forming a vortex of liquid shadows, and in the center, he saw the eye. But now he understood. What he had taken for an eye earlier was not a single being. It was just a fragment of whatever was coming. He wasn't looking at a being. He was looking at a mind, a consciousness stretching between ocean and sky. The air pressure became unbearable. The lighthouse shook as though pulled by invisible forces, and Jonas knew this was his only chance. He dashed back inside, fighting the growing weight on his chest, and threw himself at the electrical panel once more. The lighthouse glass was now completely liquid, swirling like a living mirror, reflecting not land, not sea, but something beyond existence. He wasn't sure if his mind could hold out much longer. He tore out the wires, yanking each one with all his strength, ignoring the pain shooting up his arm. The light flickered, flashing in quick patterns, as if trying to stay on, resisting shutdown. But then, in a final desperate effort, Jonas broke the main switch. The lighthouse light died. Silence fell over the ocean like a wave of absolute emptiness. For an instant, there was no wind, no sound, nothing but darkness swallowing everything around. The lighthouse glass stopped spinning. The vibrations vanished. Then, the sky began to close. The cloud vortex slowly dissipated, and the submerged structure sank back, as though it had never been there. The ocean resumed its natural motion, but something remained different. Jonas stood there, panting, unsure if he had truly stopped it, or merely delayed the inevitable. The last thing he heard before the radio finally went silent was a low, deep sound from the depths. Something was closing, but not completely. When morning finally arrived, the lighthouse still stood. There was no trace of what had happened the night before, no evidence of what he had seen. But Jonas knew. The sea still held what lay below. The lighthouse, although dark, remained a scar on reality, a reminder that the call had been made. Time had been bent for a moment, but something inside him said the thing had not given up. He looked at the ocean one last time before entering the lighthouse. He could feel it. The thing was still waiting,